So Matthew continues, "But Peter followed him afar off to the high priest's palace and went in and sat with the servants to see the end." Mark, "And Peter followed him afar off, even into the palace of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire." Luke, "And Peter followed afar off. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall, and were set down together, Peter sat down among them." John, "And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known to the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest, but Peter stood at the door outside. Then went out that other disciple, which was known to the high priest, and spoke to her." Only John mentions that also another disciple, John himself, most likely, went with him. So, "And Simon Peter followed Jesus. And Peter followed afar off." Mark, "And Peter followed. But Peter followed." Okay, I don't think the "but" actually makes much sense, so I'll put the "and" from Mark, Luke, and John. "And." Only John has Simon Peter, so I'll add Simon from John. Peter is named in all four. John has followed Jesus. Luke is just followed afar off. Mark is followed him afar off. Matthew followed him afar off. So followed is all four. So I am going to go with Jesus here because I want to include the name as often as I can. So just put him. I like being descriptive. John doesn't have afar off, just as they followed. So I'll put afar off from Luke and Mark and Matthew. Matthew to the high priest's palace. Mark even into the palace of the high priest. I think that's better. Luke has, "And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them." So it doesn't say that they made it, just it infers they made it because Peter sat down in the hall. John, "And so did another disciple." That disciple was known to the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. The word "palace" is underlined here in John, explained as courtyard, which actually makes a lot of sense because where Peter is, he's being warmed by a fire. It doesn't make as much sense to be in the house, but to be in the property, maybe inside the gate, the outer gate, in the courtyard, or in somewhere outside the house within their land. Okay, the hall. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it's among the fire. I don't think that'd be inside. Either way, even into the palace of the high priest. To the high priest's palace. I'm going to have "to" instead of "into." Because when I think of palace, I think of like a castle, like the building, the domicile, the house that they live in, where Jesus would have been brought into. But there's some separation between Jesus and Peter. Peter is with the servants. And I really think this is outdoors, and Jesus is indoors. I could be wrong, but I'm going to say "to the palace" so that he's at the location, not necessarily in the building. So I'm going to use "to" from Matthew instead of "into" from Mark. But from Mark, I will put "even." Luke just says "in the midst of the hall." That's where the fire is. John John went into the palace. So that is where I will use the into. Peter went to the palace, John went into. Maybe I'm splitting hairs, but somehow John went further in than Peter. And Peter is at the place where the fire would be, so that would maybe be inside the property, not the house. John went into the house. I have to have that John was here as well, and so did another disciple. Before I put so did another disciple, because that's closely tied with that disciple was known to the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace. First I have to mention how far they got, which is the high priest's palace. To the high priest's palace from Matthew. That's what I have to put. But from Mark, I will put even to the high priest's palace. Even to from Matthew. Should I put the palace of the high priest or the high priest's palace? I'm going to go with Mark, the palace of the high priest. It's a bit easier to say, and it's including more words. Just Mark has this, the palace is both. Of is only Mark. The high from both, and then priest from Mark. And Simon Peter followed Jesus afar off, even to the palace of the high priest. Now I can say, and so did another disciple. The so did is in italics, but I think is necessary. Because without it, you could say Peter followed Jesus and another disciple. Meaning, and also followed another disciple. That doesn't make as much sense. No. Luke. Nothing. Matthew, and went in and sat with the servants. Mark, he sat with the servants. Luke, and when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. That is better than just went in. So John, I have to have, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known to the high priest and went in. Okay, I'll use the explanation from Luke for Peter. When they had kindled the fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. John. And so did another disciple. That disciple was known to the high priest, went in with Jesus. Into the palace of the high priest. I don't want to repeat into the palace. If they're going to the palace of the high priest, then another disciple followed. That disciple was known to the high priest. I'm already repeating high priest. I don't want to also repeat the palace. If they're going in with Jesus, it's clear where Jesus has been brought already. I don't think I need to repeat. So the palace, I'll combine here. The is now with John, so it's dark blue. Palace is now all three, Matthew, Mark, John. This of is also with John. The high is all three. And priest is also mixed with John now. Matthew has to see the end, Mark, and warmed himself at the fire. So which should come first, to see the end or and warmed himself? Well, to see the end, that's talking about what happens to Jesus. Peter followed him afar off to the high priest's palace and went in and sat with servants to see the end. So all that's very combined. I think that mention of to see the end should come quickly after Peter's following him. Simon Peter followed Jesus afar off, perhaps now, to see the end, even to the palace of the high priest. Or maybe I could have even to the palace of the high priest, then to see the end. And so did another disciple. Yeah, that's where it needs to go. So after palace of the high priest, from Matthew, to see the end.